Screen to get started. And then okay, get rid of that and play. Now, does everybody see the title? Good.
Yes.
So I'm going to hide you folks. Feel free to interrupt. I've got more to say than there is time, so I'll probably have to jump from here and there. I will also be to some extent just reading off the screen as a mnemonic to keep me going, and so that I don't just sort of wander off. But please feel free to break in if there's something that I've skipped over too fast, and I'll try to deal with it. The title obviously is focused on the idea of dual inheritance, an idea that's been around really since the late 1970s, the idea that there is sort of a genetic inheritance and a somehow social, symbolic, behavioral, however you're going to think about the human side of it that's learned. And I just described it as supragenetic. And this may involve many levels of biological inheritance as well. And this is why it's multi-level, multimodal, referring to the different ways of representing and carrying information. And multi-level, of course. Recognizing that there's an inheritance going on at so many levels simultaneously and that they're all interacting. Let me see if I can make sure that this advances. Oh, there we go. So just to sort of lay out my definition of these sort of three levels, multiple levels. First of all, there's multiple biological levels and multi-level selection, and what I would rather call multi-level evolution, because I don't think it's all selection, is clearly a part of this. There's many levels of this, of information or constraints being passed forward. Culturally, there are as well, and I will try to lay out a few of these levels and talk about this process that include material artifacts, but also activities, imitation, language, art, and so on. All of these may have different evolutionary dynamics. And part of what I want to talk about is this sort of mixture of very complicated evolutionary dynamics. Multiple modes refers to basically the informational side of this. That is, there's what I call semiotic modes. A lot of my focus has been on how it is that symbolic communication that's so critical to us, but so unique in the animal world, needs to be understood in terms of its relationship to other kinds of representation-like relationships. And then, of course, we need to pay attention to media properties, because some media are very transient, like speech. Others are very durable, like writing. But there are some that we're beginning to come in contact with these days in AI that are quite generative. And all of these media properties also change evolutionary properties and how these various modes are transmitted over time. And then supragenetic, of course, refers to both what we do to the environment in terms of niche construction, and just where we live, how we change the world that we live in. And all the artifacts that we surround ourselves with, including all the way back to stone tools up to AI. So I'm going to skip the abstract because I'm hoping that most of you have read the abstract. And I want to just sort of lay out how I'm going to go through this discussion. I'm going to begin by just struggling with the concept of dual and why I want to move away from dual, although it should be obvious. And then to talk about just superficially what kind of revision is needed. Then I'm going to move on to sort of a critique of some of the models that are out there, why we need to sort of go beyond that. And then begin to develop an alternative framework that tries to put some of this together. Again, this is not meant to be a synthetic theory, but meant to show at least what we need to pay attention to. So let me start out with these two issues, the dual inheritance problem and why a revision might be needed. So I'm just going to read some of this long text so that you don't have to read it along with me or worry about it as I'm talking about something else. Extensive progress has been made in evolutionary biology by focusing on the way genetic information is transferred across generations, subject to errors and context-dependent differences in transmission rates. By analogy, if the evolution of cultural traits is also described in terms of the content, this should be context-dependent transmission of information across generations, recognizing that evolved biological dispositions constitute a major contextual factor. then many principles from evolutionary biology should also apply to social transmission of the information that distinguishes different human cultural variations and adaptations. So given that it's likely that evolutionary principles should apply, how should we approach this? And the first thing I want to say is, as I hinted at the beginning, dual is the problem. There's not just two things to pay attention to. However, there's a reason to think, at least initially, that maybe this is enough. And that has to do with the fact that the evolution of life since the last universal common ancestor has resulted in a single, incredibly conserved molecular medium for the transmission of functional information across living generations. And this happens, and it's important to pay attention to this, and I'll try to bring this up again and again. This means of passing on information, this molecular means, has coexisted always, and must coexist with the continuity of the interpretive system for translating this information, in this case, in living systems, into protein structure and the regulation of all kinds of cellular metabolic functions. So the remarkable thing is that in life as we know it after Luca, there's just one means, one way that this is done, although there are many aspects of it can be broken up into various levels. But this is a remarkably singular process. Now, in contrast, the cross-individual transmission of information that's responsible for the behavioral regularities of human culture-specific organizations has to be acquired by diverse neurological means and is constituted by multiple kinds of media and modes of representation. So this is the first contrast. The contrast is that when we look at life and the way information is maintained across living systems, we have a single system. It's like the whole world had only one language. But that's not the case in terms of cultural processes. So problems with this traditional dual concept is that it dichotomizes genetic and cultural inheritance. It basically uses this one model from biology and then applies it and oversimplifies the comparative diversity of cultural information transmission. And as a result, dual models treat all genetically transmitted information as though it's similar in form and communication properties to genetic inheritance. And of course, this is one of the challenges that we're facing in this new century. And this ignores the diversity of modes of reference, icon index and symbolic reference, media properties, of the various kinds, and the complex interpretive processes involved. Again, I'm going to focus a lot on the interpretive processes because I think one of the real challenges is when we just look at these dual models, what we often do is we ignore the fact that, excuse me, we ignore the fact that it can't work without a paired interpretive process. Otherwise, it's just a structured molecule. So now I'm going to go through quite quickly, if I can, some critiques of existing models. The first critique I want to do has to do with genetic reductionism. In fact, I think it's a critique that I would have with respect to the selectionist view of evolution in isolation from other views. Now, I'm not going to give the alternative so much as to just sort of debunk some of the simplified notions that get metaphorically transferred to our understanding of culture. And then I'm going to go on to talk about the simpler ideas, mimetic theories that are highly reduced as a result, and then the more complex cultural trait theories, but then pay a little attention to the problem of interpretation. That is, if you can't interpret the vehicles, the media by which we send something from generation to generation or from place to place. If there's no way of interpreting it, in effect, there's no information. There's just pattern. And so interpretation and how we understand the interpretive process and how it's involved in this whole transmission rate issue is absolutely crucial. So first of all, a few words on genetic reductionism. That is, thinking that we can reduce life to just the copying of a molecule like DNA or RNA. or even we can talk about the origins of life as just the copying of some molecules, the replication of molecules. I think this has been a serious error that we've been following really since the late 1970s. DNA and RNA molecules carry no intrinsic information about anything. In other words, without an interpretive process, without being embedded in a cell, they're just complicated molecules. Only when integrated into the complex translational machinery of the cell, which is as old as the last universal common ancestor, as old as the use of RNA and DNA, do they have the capacity to record, to preserve, to transmit, and convey information that has any functional consequence. And it's that functional consequence, of course, that is playing the role in what gets passed on and what doesn't. The informational properties of these molecules depend on the presence and the ubiquitous correlation of this complex interpretive machinery. Without this, there is no information. It's only molecular pattern. And yes, there's a potential for replication, for template-based replication in RNA and DNA because of the way the molecules are structured. I'll talk about how that comes about and why that's important. But I want to be clear that it's only a potential. It's only actualized in a system that has this translational capacity. So nucleic acids only inform anything. That is, they provide information when interpreted in such a system. And so what we're going to have to do in thinking about evolution is not just think about the medium of transmitting the information, but actually how that medium is coupled with and necessarily part of a larger system. So for me, this means that we need to stop focusing on genetic replication. That replication is a secondary feature. It's a feature that's really good if you want to have an easily retained and available means of transmitting information and recording information. But it's not the process of informing. So a focus on replication reduces gene function to pattern copying, and it treats its cellular effect secondary. That's the inverse of, I think, what it should be. And this is analogous to treating a word's meaning as its propensity to get copied in the culture. Yes, words get copied. They get repeated again and again, get inherited. But that's not their meaning. That has nothing to do with their function. Rather, their function is part of what's affecting whether they get copied or not, and in what context they get copied or not. So information is not intrinsic to DNA, but a systemic function of DNA in an organism. That is, it's not in the DNA, but it's in this relationship to an interpretive process. Genes serve then as a means of recording, storing, and transmitting information, but they are not the information themselves. So when we now go to think about ideas being transmitted or patterns or cultural traits being transmitted from generation to generation, I want to make it clear that it's not just something that we can collapse onto a single thing. So it's not that ideas are replicated. That is, but the signs of those ideas, these little artifacts that we use to pass on ideas and communicate them, that's what's actually replicated. The ideas and neural firing patterns that are a result of this are just fleeting. They lack fidelity and longevity, to use two of Richard Dawkins' favorite terms. An idea, for example, or a behavioral type is an interpretation of something, and it's inevitably idiosyncratic and variable person to person. So we know that even each of us understands maybe the term meme differently. Each person's idea is slightly different than each other's. What's not different, however, is the artifact that passes this on. The idea is, in this sense, like the phenotypic effect of some kind of what I call a mnemonic artifact, that is like a written text. So MEME has been passed on with incredible fidelity and fecundity and longevity. The perfect example of what Dawkins thinks is the way to talk about this, but it's not the idea. The idea has changed and it's different. It's idiosyncratic for each of us. And so in that respect, the analogy is the inverse. The thing that gets copied, that gets replicated, is a sign vehicle. The proper cultural analog of the gene is therefore a sign vehicle, that is a particular act, a specific artifact or text or something like that. It's not the idea, not the information itself. And it's separating those things I think is important into what's called a sign vehicle, that thing which stands for something else, which allows, in a sense, us to pass on information from generation to generation, even though it's not the information. It's, in a sense, that which clues that information into our thinking process. So a sign vehicle is the physical embodiment of a sign or representation relationship. It's a concrete form, such as a word, an image, an artifact, or behavior that carries information and can be transmitted across individuals and generations. I'm going to pay special attention to symbolic sign vehicles. But again, the fact that it's symbolic is not something intrinsic to the sign vehicle. It's a feature that has to do with how sign vehicles are interpreted. Sign vehicles can be interpreted in many ways, and one of those is symbolic, and I'll spend a lot of time talking about that. But symbolic sign vehicles, those vehicles that are treated as symbols, are special. And they're special because they allow for the displacement of the sign vehicle properties from the referential properties. That is, we talk about this oftentimes as the fact that word sounds, for example, don't actually carry very often clues to what they refer to and how they're to be used. We sometimes use the term arbitrarity. I think it's a misnomer, but it's important to recognize that there's kind of a separation, a displacement of features of how the sign vehicle clues something from what it actually clues in our mind. As a result, symbolic sign vehicles that are treated symbolically can be simplified and copied with incredibly high fidelity. This enables the accumulation and transmission of knowledge over time, even in the absence of direct experience, which we all know because we've used in texts that we've learned from to know about processes in the distant past or make predictions about the future. The key to this is that because the sign vehicle properties are no longer have to carry anything that is a clue to the reference, then in effect, the sign vehicle can be modified in all kinds of ways, and ways that make it much more successful as an evolvable, translatable, easily produced, easily acquired feature. So that in effect, symbolization, or the process of that I will call progressive displacement from reference, is an incredibly powerful effect. And that's one of the reasons why when we look at language or at genetics, we see this incredible displacement away from actual function. The thing that's carrying that information no longer carries features of that function. It's in effect completely displaced, but that means it can be specialized and modified in all kinds of ways and easily translated from one means of representing one kind of sign vehicle to another, one kind of medium to another. So let me just talk about the three sort of standard models. I'll talk about 6 total. But then the mimetic model of how something is translated, transferred from one person to another. Basically, it treats that which is transferred as a unit, like a gene, the so-called meme maybe, as a unit of information that's passed from brain to brain by copying some externalized pattern. And so this cartoon I have on the left is sort of this idea with M being in the meme in the minds of these people, and somehow that meme is picked up by because it's a pattern, and another pattern is produced, and that pattern gets then picked up by another mind. This is sort of the simplistic model of it. A much more complex and much more realistic model is, of course, a cultural trait, which means that there's something in the world that gets passed on. This could be an action, it could be an object, an artifact, or a way of doing something. And as a result, because it's not sort of this direct idea that now, in effect, social learning biases, transmission biases, social biases of various kinds, now can play a role. The interpretive process begins to play a much more important role. It's not just replication, but it's interpretation of replicas that becomes important. And so the cultural trait model has become, I think, much more influential for lots of good reasons. And then in effect, one of the older ideas that was generated back by Lumsden and Wilson back in the late 70s, early 80s was this idea of a culture gen. That is that because interpretation plays a significant role and the interpretive processes are, in a sense, generated by virtue of our biology, our genetics, and so on, that there's this coupling between genetic predispositions, innate predispositions, and what learning can take place or is likely to produce the evolution of information of this sort. So it's basically a stronger theory about the biological coupling to cultural traits. Sorry, I'm just getting over a cold. So Dawkins comes up with, I think, really great criteria for talking about, for him, what gets copied and the copying process. But notice, importantly, that these three criteria, which I'm going to come back to again and again, because I think they're a good way of looking at how sign vehicles get passed on. None of them talk about, in effect, the informational function. That is the function that actually plays a role in selecting. But in terms of, this is in terms of sign vehicles. The sign vehicles that have fidelity in the copying of making new ones from old ones. Fidelity is an important feature because it can get lost, and as a result, if this sign vehicle is carrying information, carrying something functional consequence, then in effect, a loss of fidelity is a loss of that representational effect. Fecundity, of course, is how often it gets produced, how much is produced, how widely it gets dispersed, and then longevity, of course, has to exist long enough. That is, the sign vehicle and the medium in particular plays a role in all of these features. The medium will determine part of its longevity. So again, what we're talking about, sign vehicles, not information, not ideas, not functions, but we're talking about the sign vehicle properties. These are absolutely crucial. And it turns out that as we begin to look at different modes of reference and different kinds of embodiments, that is, different kinds of media, this radically affects differences in fidelity, fecundity, and longevity. So a lot of people, since Dawkins presented this idea, have been very careful to sort of undo a lot of the assumptions behind this simple analogy between memes and genes. I don't know if I want to go through all of these, but let me just real quickly on this one, and then we'll sort of jump ahead. To recognize that the problem is that mimetic reductionism has specifically removed function. It's about copying pattern and treating pattern by itself and the copying of pattern as though that by itself is informational, is functional. Of course, it's not. It's an artifact of a larger process of interpreting something and reproducing something. So some of the critiques are that ideas have minimal copying fidelity from person to person, that if we think that a meme is an idea or something in the head of somebody, it turns out that, even in the most trivial transmission of ideas, memes being a classic case, basically the fidelity breaks down. We know this from the sort of game of telephone where one person whispers into the ear of the person next to them and so on down the line. That copying fidelity breaks down very quickly if we're thinking about it as ideas, but even as sentences. And then, of course, there's the problem of there's no nice, neat boundaries. The issue about genes is that they have pretty clear boundaries, although we're beginning to discover that even that is a misnomer. The match between what's a unit of information and the physical features of the medium that convey this information is not clear. There are blending effects. One of the problems of Darwin's early theory that did not have nice, neat, bounded genes that could be maintained across generations is that blending effects come in. And what happens is blending effects are the classic way that information gets lost. Because it just gets blended, so that if you imagined something rather than Mendel's inheritance of discrete traits, the reproduction of white and red flowers of pea plants would have produced pink pea plants because, in effect, they blended together if they weren't discrete traits, and they would never be unblended. And so as a result, the blending effects are a real problem if we think about the lack of nice, neat boundaries. People have struggled with all of these. I want to talk about the taxonomy problem because there's actually diverse modes of representing and copying that we have to take into account. And uh, the main thing, I think, behind all of this is that there's no account of how such a pattern ever acquired any kind of referential or functional or even replicability properties. So I want to move on from this very quickly because I could get caught up in it. I think some of the best efforts to sort of clear up some of these errors that actually come from the work of Boyd and Richardson and also Henrik. And so I think one of the most clear attempts to clean up a lot of this comes from a paper that was called 5 Misunderstandings About Cultural Evolution. Does a pretty good job because it takes into account both the interpretive factors and the transmission factors and the functional factors. And so it's a cultural trait theory, although cultural traits themselves still have a bunch of problems. I won't go into what they think are the errors and their corrections as well. But you can sort of look at the list here. This is my quick list of how they've responded to this. And let me just put this in the context of some other general ways of thinking about this mix of putting minds back into the model. That is this issue of recognizing that the transmission process is also an interpretation process and a reconstruction process. And as a result, what goes on in minds, how things are passed on mentally, the biases of learning, the biases that are social, and so on. Some of them have come from our biology. Some of them come from just patterns that we find in a local culture and so on. These biases are important, but to think about how they work in this process is not trivial. So Dan Sperber, now a generation ago, argued that we need to stop thinking about this sort of innate acquired distinction and begin to just recognize that what's going on is that ideas of producing sort of these tendencies to do certain things, tendencies to pass things on, and that to some extent, natural selection has set up a whole series of biases in terms of what things get passed on or not. And so we need to sort of decouple this idea of memes, of patterns getting passed directly from mind to mind, and begin to talk about it in terms of the fact that these are just what he calls public representations, something put out there in the world, and then we use our various biases to interpret what's out in the world. Ned Block also took an aim at this back in the 80s. He's talking about cultural artifacts, but basically public representation, a cultural artifact are basically overlapping ideas. But he makes this claim that one of the things that happens is a cultural artifact induces the receiver to create an interpretation. And in that process, there are interpretive biases that both come from biology and from the local culture, from things we've learned in the past, that affect the interpretation. And so what that means is the interpretation can change from person to person, but we use an artifact, a cultural artifact, to sort of align those interpretations as much as possible. My own view is a sort of a complication of those, but in fact, it's more complicated than is actually shown here, and I'll try to complicate it as we move along. But I want to make the idea clear of what I'm trying to get at is that there's a habit of interpreting, and the habit of interpreting is in part the result of the way the consequences of that interpretation process have actually changed things in the world, which can change the way people interpret things, but that what's actually making this possible are artifacts. Again, taking this sort of cultural artifact or public representation idea as the basis. The idea is that these are the things that get passed on are in the world. They're signed vehicles. They refer to things, but signed vehicles have unique interpretations in unique individuals. But the fact that the signed vehicle is something physical in the world, and that our actions and our ways of manipulating those things actually have consequences, and they will change the interpretive processes as well as the habit of producing them and passing them on. So from that, I want to move to complicate this a little bit, what I call the multi-level approach, and then particularly want to focus on the idea of semiotic complexity and media properties, because I think that these are the two factors that we need to add into this story. And they all have to do with this problem of interpretation. So multi-level and multimodal inheritance. Multi-level inheritance acknowledges that information is transmitted not just at the genetic level, but also at various biological and other social levels. And this includes epigenetic, behavioral, and symbolic levels. Each have their own distinct mechanisms and evolutionary dynamics. Like multi-level selection theories, multi-level evolution theories, what we see is that they don't necessarily have to be aligned either. Their different dynamics can produce different and competing, sometimes cooperating or synergistic effects. The multimodal side of this means that inheritance is the result of a diversity of semiotic modes involved in cultural transmission. Again, the important distinction here is in biology. There's one major system of sign production, sign replication, recording of information, and one kind of interpretive process. It's this genetic process that we're so familiar with. But that singularity has to be contrasted with the multimodal, multi-level, and diverse simultaneous modes of transmission that occurs at the cultural level. This means that considering not just language and digital information, but also the roles of icons, indices, and other forms of representation I'll talk about in a minute, each that have unique properties and transmission characteristics, and therefore have a unique kind of evolutionary signature. So let me just distinguish this out. So we have the semiotic and the media properties. The semiotic mode, that is the way a signed vehicle brings something else into interpretation. It can be either iconic, indexical, or symbolic in the following sense, that it's not that some signed vehicle does this. This is not a property of signed vehicles. This is a property of what the interpretive process finds in some artifact to utilize as an affordance to carry information. So iconic interpretation is the result of isomorphic affordance. There's something about the signed vehicle that is a clue to what it represents. And it's a feature of the form of it, some feature of its form. And it affords an interpretation because of that. The interpretation process looks at something, interprets something in terms of finding some feature of that signed vehicle, that physical thing in the world. And that can be an affordance. But as a result of this, it's very difficult to actually reproduce. You can't simplify it and simplify it and simplify it and get rid of some of the formal features and still have the reference there, because the reference is so dependent upon the isomorphism. And so as things simplify, you lose information. Indexical modes of reference are the result of the fact that the signed vehicle, this thing that we're using to carry the information, basically has some sort of correlational affordance. It's part of something else. It's part of a larger process. It's part of a causal relationship in which, if we understand that causality and we understand that physicality, that's going to be able to carry information about something that it's not. But by virtue of the fact that it contains within it, the signed vehicle contains within it some link to the world, to what it refers to. As a result, because the materiality or the physicality of the signed vehicle is playing a significant role, media that can be used to do this are highly constrained. That is, the medium itself has to have these properties. And so you can't just pick any old medium to represent things indexically. And then finally, symbolic, what's going on here is that the only thing that allows us to interpret something symbolically is that, in effect, we have a shared interpretive habit. Those of us who look at these sign vehicles because the sign vehicle carries no clue to its reference. The only way we can see that it refers to the same thing and is to share the interpretive habit. But as a result of this, since there's nothing in the sign vehicle that constrains that, it's now can be maximally reduced. We can simplify and simplify and simplify. We don't need the physical constraints or the formal constraints that indexical or iconic sign vehicles carry. Because of this, we can reduce this way down, and I'll talk about this again and again, but basically this is why we can take symbolic information and reduce it down to just zeros and ones in a computer, for example, as maximally reduced in terms of its physical properties. This also makes it possible for recursive relationships and then translation from one medium to another medium to another medium quite easily. And this is because the sign vehicles don't constrain this possibility, that there's nothing about it that has to be, in a sense, carried over in this translation process. All that needs to be carried over is the interpretive habit itself, and that's outside of the sign vehicle. And so that difference in what I call the semiotic mode is going to determine a lot of things about how signs of different kinds, sign vehicles of different kinds can carry information, how they evolve over time, how they change and are responsive to their environment. And then this leads us to understand the effects of the media properties themselves. That is media that has to be available. In other words, to evolve it, the more available a medium is to be manipulated in terms of its proximity or what needs to be done to them to carry this information, that plays a significant role in their evolvability. How easily they're manipulated, how easily they can be modified into forms that can be utilized for carrying information plays a role. Their robusticity, that is, how are they susceptible to being degraded over time? Can we eliminate them? Can we erase them? Can we get rid of them? Can we throw them away? Is an important feature. And of course, symbolic information can easily be erased, whereas indexical information, not quite, because the physical capacity is there in the sign vehicle. And then finally, the distributability, that is, by virtue of what kind of a unit it is it a nice, neat unit of something? Is it heavy? Is it hard to move around? How big is it? Actual physical properties are going to play a role in this evolvable tendency as well. And so the evolution of sign vehicles at the level of social processes and how they can be interpreted is going to be affected by all of these factors. These factors are going to have to be taken into account. This is why it's not just a dual story. It's a story with many subdivisions. So now let's talk about some constraints on the interpretation and transmission of icons and indices. Icons resemble what they represent, like a photograph of a person. Their fidelity, to use again one of Dawkins' criteria, can degrade with copying, and they require media that preserves spatial or temporal patterns. Their interpretation depends only on one similar sensory experience. One of the things about interpreting icons is that you need very little agreement in terms of interpretation. That is because the icon carries the information sort of in its sign vehicle. If you have any experience with things like that carry some form like that, then it's interpretable. And it's one of the reasons why we can interpret the paintings on cave walls in terms of what they represent, in terms of maybe animals or people, but have no idea how they're being used. We can interpret one aspect of it almost trivially, but to interpret the other aspects of it, it takes a great deal of complexity that we don't have available to us. Indices, on the other hand, are physically connected with what they represent, like smoke that indicates fire. And as a result, the media that convey their reference have to correlate in some way with that which is indicated. And as a result, their interpretation depends on understanding the causal properties that produce them and also understanding their material properties. Both icons and indices play significant roles in cultural transmission with different implications for their fidelity, fecundity, and longevity. And also with different capacities for carrying information, different kinds of information. And this is a crucial piece, that is that we got to stop thinking about all cultural information as being symbolic. A lot of it is just iconic. A lot of it is just indexical. And that plays a crucial role. And in fact, that's part of the context of the symbolic information that we're involved with. So now let's sort of look at how to rethink this problem. And I'm going to bring in, first of all, the multiple modes. What is the effect of multiple modes? And then a little bit about the physicality of it, and how to rethink the interpretive side of the story. So first of all, I want to talk about something I call the concept of semiotic ground, the ground of meaning, so to speak. The fundamental problem of epistemology. This is an idea that goes back to philosophy, but also as I've noted down here, Stephen Harnad in 1990 brings this possibility back up again. The ground of meaning, the thing that connects these sign vehicles to something in the world that they're about or can affect and influence and so on. This is a crucial philosophical problem. The fundamental problem of epistemology, the philosophical exploration of the concept of meaning or knowledge, is explaining how sign vehicles can provide causally useful connection to properties of objects and processes in the physical world. That is, this is a problem of grounding. How do we take these artifacts that we're sharing, like sounds or written texts, and how are they linked to the ground, have any effect in the world? This has traditionally been described, according to Stephen Harnett, as the symbol grounding problem. For him, it is a symbol problem because he's made the assumption, and this is in the beginnings of AI in 1990, that in effect, what's going on in a computer is something like a symbol, an artifact. Clearly, what's going on inside of a computer is, in fact, setting of switches, and the zeros and ones that are represented by the setting of switches basically are a completely reduced kind of sign vehicle, but nevertheless sufficiently distinguishable. But as a result, the switching patterns are not iconic or indexical. They're arbitrary. They're completely arbitrarily set up, typically with respect, and certainly at the time that Stephen Harnett was writing, with respect to words in a coding language, in a computer programming language. So the symbol grounding problem is a problem in which the ground is the real world foundation, which supports the representational relation. That is, there's something in the world that grounds these, that allows them to do something in the physical world, embeds them in the world of actual function. The two major affordances for intrinsic grounding, and I want to talk about intrinsic versus extrinsic grounding, are first, shared formal properties like sign vehicles and objects. In other words, iconic communication is grounded by the fact that the sign vehicle contains some feature that is formally related to what they're referring to. And the second one is physical temporal correlation or contiguity, indexicality. That is, if the sign vehicle itself has some physical characteristic, even if it's just a correlation with something in the world, that's part of its grounding. And Stephen Harnad recognized this, but he actually didn't think of iconicity and indexicality as somehow representational, thinking that symbol grounding was only this kind of thing that's going on in terms of zeros and ones or arbitrary sign vehicles. So let me just talk about this idea of semiotic grounding in terms of icons, indices, and symbols. So there can be natural icons and conventional icons. And we see these over on the left. And then, of course, there can be natural indices where there's actual correlation, but also artificially created objects that can provide a correlational relationship in a much more complex way, but it's certainly conventional. So both iconic and indexical interpretive processes are grounded, that is, by the sign vehicle properties that are shared in some respect with what that sign refers to. Sign vehicle properties can thus invoke reference by cueing interpretations that share these properties. So these are grounded in a sense. They take, as a result, less interpretive activity to make sense of it, we can just sort of look at it and like these eye spots on a moth's wings, can actually, by virtue of perceptual tendencies that have evolved in a potential predatory species, for example, to see these as similar to, structured like eyes, and therefore representing something that is not what this moth is. It takes very little interpretive effort to make sense of this. In fact, mostly it happens automatically. Now let's compare this with symbols. The symbols in this case are written symbols of various kinds. So a rune from Britain, cuneiform in the middle, and of course hieroglyphics on the right. Sign vehicle properties shared in common with what's referred to turn out to be irrelevant for interpreting the symbols. Even those that look like something may not be carrying iconism in the simple sense. So, and this is particularly true for the hieroglyphs, which were for a very long time thought was just to be sort of pictorial. It turns out it's a rebus system in which, yes, the staff, there's this sort of middle staff thing that looks like a little walking stick in the middle, does refer to something. In fact, they're called gam, but it turns out that it was the syllable gam that it referred to, and so that by putting these together, it's gam something gam. Another word, they became a rebus, and this is just a convention of interpretation. But convention, I want to point out that conventional association, there's this reference of convention. And now it's important to recognize that the sign vehicles themselves are the result of a convention, but the way that the sign vehicle refers to something else is also conventional. So there's a kind of double conventionality here. Convention, I want to point out, however, is itself a semiotic relationship. Conventions have to be constructed. But in fact, you can't construct convention from the first place from convention, because if it has to be constructed, you're caught up in a chicken and egg problem. As a result, conventions are established using already grounded forms of semiotic relationships, iconic and indexical communication. In order, you need iconic and indexical communication to construct these relationships. As a result of this, though, by virtue of the fact that you now only have this conventional connection, this produces the displacement from grounding. Displacement from grounding means that, in effect, now the sign vehicle doesn't in itself carry a direct clue to its reference. This displacement from grounding affords unrestricted referential possibilities. That is, any squiggle can refer to anything else. But this happens at the cost of there being no clues to help you ground reference. So in effect, this first step of displacement is also an encryption step. That is, looking at these runes on the far left, they're completely encrypted. They're encrypted because if you don't know the interpretive process, the conventional interpretive process, they will never mean anything to anybody. And so this is one of the reasons that, of course, knowledge of past scripts gets lost. It gets lost because the interpretive habit, the shared interpretive habit of conventions has been lost as well. And once that's lost, it can't be recovered again. And what we'll see is that as we have more and more displaced forms of reference that can be translated and displaced into other forms of reference, as we have done with sort of words replaced into sequences of zeros and ones, of ons and offs in a computer, they become progressively encrypted by multiple levels of displacement. One of the things I wanted to point out is that, of course, these things are almost always incorporated within each other. And probably the most famous example of this that goes all the way back to the Greeks has to do with what are called signet rings. And you're probably all familiar with this idea that as you seal a folded piece of paper that's going to carry a somewhat private message, you can seal it with wet wax. But at the time it's still wet, it's capable of taking on a an impression of something else. And so what we see here, there's the shared form between the signet ring and the impression on the wax. But there's also physical contiguity. That is, we know when we receive this that someone that carried the ring that actually probably had something to do and knew what was in this envelope, in this letter, was there present and physically in touch with it. That it's telling us the indexicality is like a signature. It's saying that I was there and did this and closed it. But the fact that this is a way of communicating that information, that I sent this because I alone have this ring and I was present physically there, and the iconism that you see this shows that it was me who did it. All of this is the result of a social convention. And in fact, if you don't understand this process, somebody sees this for the first time, they don't know this social convention. They may still see iconism and indexicality here, but not understand that this is about creating, in effect, a secretive or slightly encrypted message on this piece of paper. So basically, the icon index and symbol relationship are all sort of tied up together. And in fact, this is part of the conventional problem. The conventional problem says that you need iconic and indexical relationships in order to construct conventional relationships or symbolic relationships. And this now provides a much more complicated picture. It's a picture in which it's not just the case that there are icons out there and indices out there and symbols out there. These have to do with interpretive processes. The sign vehicle can be conventional. You can have a conventional icon, a conventional index, or a conventional symbol. In fact, symbols can't be other than conventional for a variety of reasons because they're going to be arbitrarily associated with what they refer to. And the reference is organized by virtue of isomorphic features, physically grounded features, or just conventionally grounded features. But the point I've made here with these arrows at the bottom is that in order to produce real displaced reference, one of the things that's necessary is that there's prior iconic and indexical processes involved in producing this. That means that symbolic reference, displaced reference, which has all the advantages that I've been talking about, has to be built up from prior iconic and indexical interpretive processes. It's only this way that the intrinsic semiotic clues, the intrinsic groundedness, can now be removed by virtue of a couple of steps. And I'll try to explain how to think about that. Here's a nice simple way to imagine it. This is a case of imagine yourself being someone that's come from another country that's found yourself in an airport for the first time looking out the window, and you're seeing this thing flapping around. Now, this is a windsock. We all know what this means, but now sort of put yourself back in this sort of innocent perspective. You see it for the first time. Do you know by looking at it that it plays some role in indicating the direction and the strength of the wind? However, iconically, when you look at this, it automatically brings up various similar sorts of visual experiences. For example, the blowing of trees off of a tree, leaves off of a tree, or the wind sort of tossing your hair out or causing a material to be horizontally distributed where it normally would sort of fall to the ground or fall to gravity. In all of these cases, each one is an iconic interpretation of this. There's something similar. It has similar form to something else that there is in memory. But there's also another level of iconism, higher order from this, and that is the fact that each of these icons, iconic interpretations, or interpretants, as the Charles Peirce called them, basically have some iconism among them that is not the initial iconism, and that is they're each correlated also with wind. And as a result, there's a higher order iconism. That is an iconism among the icons. That is that they all share wind, and as a result, we can now begin to see this initially just sort of unfamiliar iconic feature as an index of something that's invisible. So you're inside looking out the window, and you can still infer, even the very first time you saw it, that it's providing some information about the direction and strength of the wind. This gives you an idea that indexical interpretation is built up from iconic interpretation, or what you might call multi-level iconic interpretation, finding the icons among the icons. The point I want to make is this is also true for building up indirect reference. So I think we want to talk about iconic and indexical sign vehicles as carrying either an isomorphic affordance in its features or a correlational affordance. But as I just showed you, to see the correlational affordance, we need to know something about the relationship between iconic relationships. And the argument I want to make here is that, in effect, to build a kind of affordance that is no longer in the sign vehicle, we need to find this sort of process by which you can use the isomorphic and correlational effects to, in effect, displace away from the original grounding of a referential feature. So it becomes symbolic and therefore capable of manipulation in ways that those that are constrained by this grounding are not. So I like to call this process ungrounding, though it's interesting that the sign vehicle is ungrounded while maintaining referential grounding, for example, in language. So ungrounding involves the elimination of physical features of the sign vehicle that are shared with its reference. Maintaining reference despite loss of intrinsic grounding is accomplished by transferring the intrinsic grounding implicit in icons and indices to systematic iconic and indexical combinatorial relationships between the ungrounded sign vehicles. Think about, for example, that in language, words next to each other point to each other and modify each other, or words more distantly have less of an effect. And yet we can have agreements, iconistic kind of relationships between the meanings of words distantly in a sentence, or iconism between sounds, as in poetry and rhyme. All of these features, in effect, allows, once we have the sign vehicles displaced so that their characteristics, their intrinsic features are no longer about reference, now we can use other aspects of the sign vehicle itself to manipulate them and to organize them in various ways. So intrinsic sign vehicle properties now, in this case, need only be distinguishable from each other, not having to do with anything in the world other than that. This allows unrestricted simplification. So this is why we can go from words or letters to Morse code or to zeros and ones in a computer. As a result, there's an unconstrained combinatorial possibility that can take advantage of all of these relationships as well. And so one of the things I want to say, it's one of my critiques of linguistics, is that a lot of what we would call rules in linguistics, I think, are the result of the iconic and indexical relationships that are already afforded by the fact that you've made this displacement of reference. So very quickly, I want to talk about, so how is it that this happens? How is it that a convention can be established without convention? And the answer, I think, was hinted at by the philosopher David Hume a long time ago in his analogy of rowers in a boat, in which they're unable to communicate to each other, but they find themselves in the middle of a lake somewhere. And the only thing they can do as they get more and more hungry or cold or whatever is they have to get to the shore. How do they do so? How do they come to an agreement, a convention, a way of doing things together that works? They have to have a bunch of, take advantage of each other's unintended indices. And that is that when they're not in synchrony, they're indicating that somehow their intentions are not the same. They eventually discovered that only working synchronously, only rowing at the same time, can they actually move away from the center. And so they discover, by virtue of the indices of what works and doesn't work, of what seems to cause them to go in circles versus moving together, they come to an agreement or a convention by virtue of the iconic and indexical information that's passed by their very actions. And as a result, they now have an agreement. And upon that agreement, they can build more and more, increase their speed, figure out what direction they want to go to, and so on and so forth, all without communicating symbolically. I want to point out that something like this is also going on when we learn words. And I'll bring this up in a couple of ways. Again, talk about also how this is relevant to the genetic story as well. One of the things that's happening is that when we learn words, we hear the same sound again and again and again. And that is, as a result, they're iconic of each other's events. But if it's correlated with an index, something that says couple these two things, then in effect, we've got a pointing, but the pointing by itself doesn't actually fix things. But if the word is iconistically repeated and the indexical relationship is repeated again, each indexical linkage with the word and with some object is also iconic. So it's another version of iconic relationships among indices. But now the things that they point to, of course, are all going to be slightly different. And the problem of learning words is to figure out, given these contrasting instances, there's, in a sense, an implicit need to find out, well, what is iconic in each of these? Iconic is not the features, not the facial features, but some cryptic iconism. And so what we do when we learn words is we learn that they're about types, about properties. They're not about individual things. Those would be names. These are not names. Words are not names. And we see this is true. So that basically we're asked to discover an iconism that is cryptic, a cryptic iconism in a kind, in the things out in the world. But as a result, now they're properties. And as a result, this is why they can be so displaced. They're not specific things. They're general features. And this is this process of displacement. And the point I want to make is that basically a similar relationship is going on genetically. I think we can think about the relationship between the codons in DNA and RNA, which I've indicated at the top line here, as being, in a sense, linked to some function in the world in a similar sort of fashion. Although this is a process that's not learned, it evolved some time ago, but notice that it has the same general structure. That is what's happening is that by virtue of this linkage of isomorphisms to contiguity and correlational relationships, it's possible to produce this complete displaced reference so that this string of molecules can have something to do with the actual three-dimensional functioning of a protein. What's interesting in this process that this linkage has the same kind of structure, but it also means that there's something else interesting here. And that is once you've displaced onto a different kind of sign medium, onto a different kind of medium from this string of bases to a protein molecule, for example. Now, since both of them are physical processes, it turns out that the DNA molecule has a particular twist to its helix form by virtue of the sequence of bases that make it up. It changes the twist slightly. And proteins can actually be produced that also have a corresponding or a complementary twist to them. And as a result, proteins can now bind to DNA molecules specific to their twist, which can affect the sequence. It can affect how that sequence is activated or inactivated. So you've got this recursive possibility. One of the things that happens with displacement of reference like this is that it affords new kinds of recursive relationships in which new properties can now be utilized and to some extent can be utilized to modify themselves in complicated ways. And it's this process of displacement that means again and again new properties. Typically, new physical properties can be taken advantage of, but also new iconic and indexical properties. Certain proteins will bind to each other by virtue, for example, of their complementary structure, their hydrophobic or hydrophilic superstructure. So let me begin to summarize now. And just what we might want to expect. What are the properties we want to take advantage of? So let's talk about iconic communication. Here, of course, is an iconism of something we've discovered. This from one of the Lascaux caves, in which it's very clear that there's representation, iconic features here represented. And the relationships between the icons is pretty, it doesn't take much of an effort to interpret the iconism here. That is, you and I, tens of thousands of years separated from this, can interpret the iconism clear, but we have no idea if this played some symbolic role or not. So iconic communication requires high fidelity replication. If some of this was simplified to a certain level, it may be such that it becomes harder and harder to interpret the iconism. So think about up here on the top right, how it looks like they have that baby antelopes or baby deer are being represented by these sort of smaller, non-filled stick-like figures. We can't be sure, it's less sure. The more detail is in the iconism, the better. But as a result, it takes more work to produce a signed vehicle. It takes a lot of work to get one to look like what's out there in the world. And that means there's a relative slowing of the reproduction possibility. It takes time to do this. It takes effort to do this. But as a result of putting all that effort up front, it's very little interpretive work to see it iconically. But as a result, it also requires that media properties, in this case, a pigment on a wall, are able to accommodate all the formal details. If there wasn't a way to sort of discretely represent this with the particular pigment that was being used, it would just simply not be there. So there's a lot of media specialty that's required here to make iconic communication work. And as a result, also, details will degrade both with copying and with simplification. So if 30 people each took one of these figures and tried to copy it by looking at it once and then copying it, looking at it again, and passing it to the next person, those copies would degrade over time, just as simplification has degraded it. If you don't have as much time to produce it, you can't put as much energy into it, degradation becomes very, very common. So iconic communication has advantages, interpretive advantages in particular, but a lot of disadvantages in terms of this process of reproducing and maintaining fidelity across translations. Indexical communication is a little bit different. It doesn't require the kind of copying fidelity. So here we see some other things done on a piece of rock here. And these are indexical. The medium is highly constrained, so that we think that number matters, number of lines, number of dots, maybe playing some crucial role, because they're corresponding to numbers of something, individual cases of something. Indexical reference is now mediated by the properties. The actual fact that there's 4 lines or 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14 dots, or that they're parallel. All of these are saying that the signed vehicle properties are actually playing a crucial role here. There's iconism also hidden in here. There's 4 of something. There's 10 of something. There's a line of something. So we know that their iconic properties are also relevant, but it's actually this sort of just correspondence relationship that's carrying a lot of the information as well. As a result, interpretation requires some prior familiarity with the causality and the physicality of what's represented here. We need to know something about this, but we also need, in this case, there's some sort of conventional feature as well. Doesn't make it a symbol per se, but it does require both iconic and indexical interpretation, and it requires knowing something about the physicality, the number of things, the type of thing, and so on that's being represented here. As a result, they're very different kinds of transmissions. Now, one of the most interesting features is that as people have begun to collect large amounts of these kinds of marks that are not so easily iconically interpreted, but seem to have been simplified considerably, what we find is that there are a lot of them that are shared across different populations, and sometimes shared even across whole continents, perhaps because the iconic and indexical features are so prominent, but again, the requirement of simplifying makes it difficult as well. So we're not sure how much of each of these little kind of marks are, for example, iconic, indexical, or just symbolic. For the most part, we think that a lot of the features of them that look like something, that have, for example, indexical features, like particular numbers of lines, or iconic of actual hands, or of what looks like tree-like features, or, for example, squiggles, spirals, zigzags. These might have to do with things that have iconic features, but they're so simplified that we can't know for sure. And it's that simplification that suggests that they can also be playing a symbolic role. So we don't know for sure how to interpret the symbolic features here, but we do know how to interpret their indexical and iconic features. And we use them to sort of guess at the symbolic functions. But as a result, once we move to symbolic communication, it turns out that a lot is gained. This displacement process, which effectively encrypts things, is also very powerful in an evolutionary sense. Symbolic sign vehicles, therefore, don't need to be sharing any attributes of what they refer to, but they have to be interpreted in the same way by different individuals. This allows unlimited sign vehicle simplification. That is, we can do it simpler and simpler. We can throw out details as much as possible. That just simply is corresponded by the more details that are thrown out, the more agreement of interpretation has to be increased in order to still communicate with these things. But this makes it possible to also produce these things much more easily and manipulate them much more easily, combine them in different ways. The more simple they are, the more displaced they are, the easier it is to produce them, the easier it is to manipulate them in different ways, to have them interact. And as a result, as the displacement increases, interpretive support has to increase as well. And the issue here is that these shared interpretive habits have to be supported by virtue of prior iconic and indexical communication. That you need to have the kind of evolution of the interpretation system in parallel with the communication system, with the sign vehicle evolution. In fact, precisely because you've lost this intrinsic affordance, this intrinsic grounding. But it produces all of these secondary advantages. So this is basically the externalization problem. That is, we've offloaded onto more and more different media. And this is in effect going to modify cultural evolution, the transition from organization just by behavior that we see in lots of other species to those that are organized by some version of symbolic or linguistic-like communication, has really offloaded something onto one of these kinds of much more flexible sign vehicles, much more easily evolved sign vehicles. And as we move from oral communication to written communication of various kinds, and to alphabetic communication and so on, each of these displacement steps has had a significant effect on the evolutionary possibilities underlying all of this. So externalizing information onto media like writing or digital storage offloads some of the cognitive burden of transmission and allows for greater informational density and complexity, and I should say here, evolvability. However, it also introduces new dependencies on the technology, including parallel replication of the interpretive mechanisms that are needed to access the stored information. In other words, the more we've displaced it, the more we've put more demand on the interpretive process. And this raises questions about the long-term accessibility and preservation of cultural knowledge, particularly in our case, by electronic digital means. The electronic means are now radically encrypted, where the text that we could read from people of the past or the paintings on cave walls could be interpreted at least in some level. But now that our words and ideas have been, in a sense, offloaded again and again from one kind of media to another and simplified in the process, they also become progressively encrypted and unavailable to us. So that if electronic digital computers begin to fail, no longer work, or in which the support system that keeps this stuff going suddenly breaks down, all of this information that's been stored and transmitted into digital form, which is so wonderful in terms of the way it gets preserved and copied and transmitted, becomes basically unavailable. So there are a number of challenges in this process that we need to keep track of. So let me just lay out a couple of conclusions from where I've gone so far. First of all, cultural dual inheritance models oversimplify this process, radically oversimplify it by just using this analogy. In human societies, information transmission occurs through lots of different levels and lots of modes and lots of media. It's not just two parallel systems. The theory of social transmission is going to need to incorporate the semiotic complexity, the interpretive process that go along with it and in their pairing, and also the medium properties, how they have changed this process. Written, electronic, and physical media, like buildings and roads and clothing, are also inherited, and they're inherited with different semiotic and media properties. And as a result, they'll have also a different evolutionary dynamics, but an evolutionary dynamics that's part also and linked in also with the displaced communication that we engaged in. So semiotic displacement finally frees up media constraints, and it enables this progressive displacement onto more and more evolvable media, from speech to writing to print to digital media. But as I pointed out before, this also comes with a cost. That is, the interpretive cost has to increase. And eventually it makes us more susceptible to full encryption, in which things become unavailable, evolving fast, but now evolving in a way that we can't trace. So with that, I'll stop. I've gone over time. I hope it's not been too much, but thank you very much for sticking with me if you have.